and evolution in the theory. He writes that this is his memoir, one of his memoirs, On the Trembling of the Veil. But just before I read it, Huxley and Tyndall. Huxley was known as Darwin's bulldog, T.H. Huxley, and was a popularizer for evolution. Had a famous debate in Oxford with Bishop Wilberforce, which is much celebrated. But he's holding these figures up as adopting a certain view of the world, which I think throughout his career, and despite my opening remarks about the variousness and diversity of Yeats over different phases, there are nonetheless continuities. And I think this sense of valorizing what we might call the imagination and visionary truth against grey truth, of which he calls in one of his poems grey truth, of science and surfaces. Yeats disdains materialism, not simply an acquisition, we're talking about materialism, but a certain view of the world which buttresses science and progress and that kind of Victorian idea that everything is explained, which Yeats would have seen as desacralizing. It's a big word. Sacral is the same root as the word sacred. I think Yeats was very resistant to a scientific method of explication which stripped away mystery, depth, vision, poetic truth. So he went through various phases in his life looking for ways, things to replace that. It might have been the occult, it might have been Irish mythology, or folklore, or French symbolism at various points. But there is that sense of, in terms of philosophy, pitting himself against what we might call positivist philosophy. Let me just read this quotation. I was unlike others of my generation in one thing only. I am very religious, and deprived by Huxley and Tyndall, whom I detested, of the simple-minded religion of my childhood, I have made a new religion, almost an infallible church of poetic tradition, of a fardel of stories, and of personages, and of emotions, inseparable from their first expression, passed on from generation to generation by poets and painters, with some help from philosophers and theologians. I wished for a world where I could discover this tradition perpetually, and not in pictures and in poems only, but in tiles around the chimney piece and in the hangings that kept out the draught. One could spend a good while analysing that passage, because I think it's a very suggestive one, and it has its own internal contradictions. He's deprived. Tyndall and Huxley are intellectually persuasive at the same time as they are despised. That suggests a sort of a conflict in him, and I think there is a lot that one could say about Yeats' attitude to science. But let's take him at his word. One should be careful about people's autobiographies, because they're often an act in retrospective myth-making. People present themselves the way they want to be seen. So we should be careful about autobiographies, and Yeats is not the least, that's for sure. But let's just take him at his word and realise that he puts himself very much against this, the idea of Huxley and Tyndall, and looks for alternatives, looks for poets and painters and philosophers and theologians, for systems. And the search for systems, whether in received knowledge, some of it, pretty wacky, we might say, or in systems he invented himself, is a feature of Yeats' life. I think it helps us understand his poetry, and particularly the visionary quality of his poetry, and the fact that it defies an attempt simply to logically explain it every time, when we realise that he's seeing it as a way of preserving imaginative power and visionary truth in a modern world. With this materialism, empiricism, science, he associates the rise of the middle classes. He also pits himself against the middle classes. He dislikes the middle classes, the Irish middle classes, and he sees Ireland sometimes as an area which there is still a reservoir of visionary spiritual truth, connections to an organic, older mode of knowing, which can operate as a salve or an alternative to debased modernity that he sees exemplified mostly in England. And that's at the heart of some of his nationalism, some of his cultural nationalism, which at times spills into political nationalism.